Education, in the words of Nelson Mandela, is a powerful tool used to change the world. Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon session, we're going to talk about teacher and learner classroom roles. Now, I want you to focus your attention on the following images and guess the word. This is actually called a four peaks in one word, and I do believe that you are familiar with this one. Okay, are you ready? Precisely. This one is called teaching. Teaching is defined as an interactive process between teacher and students. It actually refers now to the interaction taking place in order to achieve the desired goal or those things that a student cannot do before, especially in achieving a particular task or a goal. And actually, both teachers and students can benefit by this interaction. So there are cases where the students can learn from the teachers because they act as the source, a credible source of information. And at the same time, there are also those information coming from students which can also benefit the teachers, thus enhancing his or her instructional orientation and classroom management. But now it begs the question, what's the purpose of teaching at all? The sole purpose of teaching is to help the learner to acquire new habits, knowledge, and skills, which together enable him or her to do something that they could not do before. But later on, as we will explore in our discussion, we cannot also rely alone on teachers, not because they are considered to be unauthentic or not credible anymore, but also because the students also have their roles to portray in learning. And important thing to mention here is that it's not only about academics, but also the formation of core values and the character. Next one. Can you now guess the word? Exactly. This is what we call now as learning. So basically, what is learning? When we say learning, it refers to the cognitive process of acquiring skill or knowledge. So aside from a cognitive or a mental exercise, it's also referring to the process of seeking out or finding out or even learning or determining with certainty, usually by making an inquiry or other effort, especially in the cases where we have to clarify those things which are a little bit murky or foggy. At this juncture, we have to set the ground, and that is why I have to give you the content or the framework in this afternoon session, starting off with the definition of terms. Second, we have to know the difference between the student-centered and the teacher-centered approach. Third one, we have to identify the teacher's roles, and lastly, the student's roles. Let's first define the teacher. The teacher here is defined as any character or personification whose occupation is teaching. It also refers to a personified abstraction that teaches, and the best example of this is our experience. That is why whenever we talk about learning in general, we point to the formal and informal ones. Formal as in there's an instruction, and informal in the case of our experiences. In a way that we learn something and we can also inspire other people from our experiences. In addition, a teacher is also a person involved in the interactive behavior with one or more students for the purpose of effecting change. And that is in this context where we talk about the general definition of education, wherein it's defined as simply as the process, no, of facilitating persons to acquire knowledge, or simply the process of being educated. And now you might want to say, sir, how can you say that? It's simply the difference between education and educated. You just change the suffix from ion to ed. But that's exactly the point, isn't it? Because in the process of being educated, we highlight or emphasize the process. And although learning is considered to be an active process, part of which is to learn. On the side, we talk about learner, no? As someone, especially a child, who learns as from a teacher, no? Or takes up the knowledge or believes. It can actually refer as well to the person, no? Who works for an expert in order to learn a trade. Whatever specific field or field of expertise you are trying to exercise or master, you are considered to be a learner or a disciple of knowledge. Classroom basically refers to the context, a room or in a school, no, where lessons take place. But later on, again, we have to stretch that one as we go along in our discussion. And very important here is the term roles. These are considered to be the actions and activities assigned to or required or expected of a person or group. Normal or customary activity of a person in a particular social setting. And of course, this is connected to a particular occasion or a context. Like, for example, if you are in the classroom or in school, what is expected of you as a student now? This is what we are talking about, the roles between teachers and students. What can you see from the illustration? So there are a lot of words and images and other abstractions like open, like education, like ideas, learn, next, share. So my task here for you is that in our Google Classroom, can you please comment your opinions or any learning insights, anything that you can share regarding this illustration, of course, in the context of our discussion for today's session. Now, you might want to ask, why do we have to consider the teacher-centered versus the student-centered approach, given that I'm only talking about the responsibilities or the roles between the teachers and learners? Why do we have to include this one? This is very important in the sense that without the difference between these approaches, we cannot also link the classroom management and the instructional orientation. And so we become misguided onto what specific approach, or we don't know what specific approach do we have to take up in order to better understand why is this considered to be the role of a teacher, for instance, or why is this considered to be the role of a learner. So at least we get the a proper approach or the proper information or the source. We get the overview as to or justification as to why we can say that these are considered to be the roles of the teachers and the roles of the learners. Did you get that? Okay. So we have here that the differences between the teacher-centered and the person-centered. But actually, for years, no, people's understanding of classroom management was rooted in behavioral theories of teaching and learning. In other words, the primary emphasis for classroom management in a behavioral model is the use of certain techniques or methodologies or even strategies that bring students' behavior under a stimulus control. This means that these behavioral approaches to classroom management are considered with a traditional or what we call transmission approach to instruction. And so, over the last decade, however, Views on good instruction have shifted. That is why educators are now encouraged to implement an instructional approach based on a constructivist principles of learning. You see, there's now a distinguishing factor between the traditional or behaviorist versus the constructivist. Behaviorist for teacher-centered and constructivist for student-centered. Now, let's first focus on the teacher centered. So, it is discussed here that the teacher is considered to be the sole leader, and so it is implied here that the teacher is the source, the ultimate source of information, nothing more, nothing less. Management is a form of oversight. Teacher takes responsibility for all the paperwork and organization. And of course, no, it's clear or obvious that the discipline comes from the teacher. A few students are the teacher's helpers. The teacher makes the rules and posts them for all students. The consequences are fixed for all students, or as we commonly know it, no, in the context of Philippines, especially in Davao, pakwan, one pak, pak one pak all, something like that. We also have rewards, no, are mostly extrinsic, and the students are allowed limited responsibilities, and a few members of the community enter the classroom. So, classroom management is, as we know it, is a multifaceted concept that includes the organization of the physical environment, the establishment of rules and routines, and even the development of effective relationships and the prevention of and response not to misbehavior. So, it is helpful now to view classroom management beliefs and practices on a continuum from teacher-centered to a student-centered. This is more likely the case as that because educators vary, no, along a continuum of beliefs about the way children learn to behave and conceptualize this as one's pupil control ideology. So, uh, at the one end of the continuum is the custodial, or what we call now as the teacher-centered approach, and at the other end naman is the humanistic or the student-centered approach. So it can be gleaned here that the differences between the two, no, especially right now that we talk about the person or the student centered, no, so a leadership is shared. So the information right now is not only for the teachers. So it is in this context where we talk about the collaborative effort. There's also a participation, collaboration of the information, not only between the student to student, but also teachers to student. So management is a form of guidance. Students are facilitators for the operations of the classroom. The discipline comes from the self. All students have the opportunity to become an integral part of the management of the classroom. Rules are developed by the teacher and the students in the form of a constitution or compact. It doesn't only come from teacher, no? Without asking the students' opinion or perhaps the the role of the student. Consequences reflect individual differences. Rewards are mostly intrinsic. Students share in classroom responsibilities. Partnerships are formed with business and community groups to enrich and broaden the learning opportunities for students. So, in contrast now to traditional instruction, the student centered approach focuses on meaning making, inquiry, and even authentic activity. So, the instructional goal here in student centered classrooms are based of a constructivist principles of learning where it has something to do with the creation of learning environment where knowledge is best constructed and shared, no, among learners and even teachers. And in this approach, it is explained that students are expected to strive to make sense of what they are learning by relating it to prior knowledge and by discussing it with others. So now the class acts as a learning community that constructs shared understanding. Okay, These are the main contentions about the teacher-centered. So in the teacher-centered classrooms, control is of primary importance and authority is transmitted hierarchically, meaning the teacher exerts control over the students. So now the critics of teacher-centeredness argue that in these classrooms, compliance is valued over initiative and passive learners over active learners. So, to help teachers maintain control over students, instructional methods that promote a focus on the teacher are frequently used, such as lectures, guided discussions, demonstrations, and cookbook labs. These forms of instruction lend themselves to having the teacher stand in the front of the classroom while all students work on the same task. Uh, on a similar note, the physical design of the classroom often promotes a focus on the teacher and limits student activity that disrupts that focus. In other words, rooms are often organized so that the desks face toward the primary focal point, who is no other than the teacher. Now, as you can see from the illustration, as I was talking about the physical arrangement, no, especially as to the arrangement of the seats. Now we see here that the teacher must be located at the front or even at the center, to draw attention from the students so that the students will never be disrupted, and so their focus alone is on the teacher as the source of authority. How about the student-centered? The educator with a more humanistic orientation is likely to maintain a classroom climate in which active interaction and communication, close personal relationships with students, mutual respect, positive attitudes and flexibility of rules, as well as student self-discipline, self-determination, and independence are fostered. That is why when we say in a student-centered management, it is proposed that children see their acceptable caring behavior as vital to the maintenance of the group because they have vested interest in the health of the group as a whole. The advocates as well of the student-centered approach to classroom management propose that teachers minimize the use of extrinsic rewards because they may adversely affect the student motivation, even create reliance on the teacher, and encourage appropriate behavior for the sake of a reward rather than for the good of the group. So as you can see from the illustration, we see now the various forms of seating arrangement of the students. So it can either be, as you can see, it's more flexible than the traditional ones. So we have here as a sample, we have the U-shape, large classroom, and we also have horseshoes, and of course the groups of four. In addition, teachers, on specifically in the context of teacher-centered approach, teachers exert their control through a system of clearly defined rules,
Unfortunately, for most of our
routines,
students,
and
most of our
expectations
classrooms are still
that are
teacher-centered,
mandated
and they really
rather than
haven't changed that
developed
much over
with
the
the
last
students.
100 years.
Generally,
Instruction is
the
normally
teachers
given to the
identify
whole
the
class,
rules
commonly
necessary for
through a
an
lecture.
orderly classroom
For many
and time
teachers, their
set
main
aside
resource is
for
still
the
a
teaching of
textbook.
these rules during the first several
Homework
days
is
of
then given to
school.
the student,
So,
usually through a
when students
worksheet or
exhibit
possibly
undesirable
a writing
behavior,
assignment.
advocates of the
After several
teacher-centered
lessons like
approach
this,
often rely
students are
on
usually given a
punishments,
test,
such
and
as
then we can try to
reprimands,
determine what they learned
fines,
and what they didn't learn.
timeouts, and
Finally, at
the
this time,
loss
we
of
now know which
special
students did get
privileges.
it and which students didn't get
And
it.
the teachers may also
Unfortunately,
rely on
now what we're
extrinsic
left with is not
motivation to
intervention, but
influence
now we're
student
left with
behavior. So
remediation.
here,
This is a
marking a
very
task
passive
easy
way for
as a
students to learn
prerequisite
and a very
for
ineffective
some
way for
grades.
teachers to be able to intervene.
Rewards like praises
Fortunately,
or
there is
any
a
other
better
positive
way to
feedback,
educate.
activity
Student
rewards
centered
like
learning
free
is
time,
best
computer
accomplished
time,
through blended learning.
playtime, and
By
tangible
definition,
rewards like even
blended learning
candy,
is
stickers, or
student centered
giving a
learning.
mark on your hand like very
Blended
good,
learning
five
is using
stars.
technologies in
In
ways we've
contrast,
never
a
used before.
constructivist
It's
teacher
providing
has
instruction,
embraced the
direct
student-centered
instruction to
approach,
students
is
at their own pace,
interested
not the
primarily in
pace
helping
of
the
the rest of the
child
class.
engage
Blended
problems
learning
and
gives the teacher the
issues.
opportunity to provide small group
That is
instruction,
why the
and those students
development
are all
of
on the same
the
page. They will be
interpersonal
taught exactly
relationships
what they
is
need
an
to know
essential
when they need to
component.
know it. With blended
Since
learning, there
positive
can be
student teacher
space for students
relationships
to work together,
presumably
to teach
lessen
each other, and to
the
reinforce
need for
concepts that
control
we as
and
teachers
become the
want them to know.
foundation for
With
all
blended learning,
interaction
students do
in
have some
the
control over how much
classroom.
time they will take to
So to
complete
better
an assignment
understand
and
this
what pace they will
concept,
work at.
allow me to share this
And if
video
students need
so
more
you can
time to
listen
complete an
and write your
assignment, they
comments
have
on how
every
we do in
resource they
classroom.
need
Alright?
to help them complete it away from school. And learning is no longer confined to just when the teacher is available. Learning can now happen anytime when the student is ready. Blended learning provides students with immediate feedback. They know exactly where they are and exactly what they need to do on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour basis. And we can assist students. We can teach them how to plan and how to set academic goals. To be active learners, not passive learners, and to feel the sense of accomplishment that that brings. Now that students are armed with these well-designed tools, now they can take ownership of their own learning and ultimately learn how to learn and become lifelong learners. From a teacher's point of view, now they can understand immediately what student is struggling, where they're struggling, and ultimately why they're struggling. Then they can begin the process of helping that student get back on track.
Now let's proceed to the roles of the teachers. So in traditional classroom, a teacher speaks while the students listen. This works great for some students, but not so well for others. Primarily because of the three things. Number one, students who already know the content can get bored. Second, students who are behind cannot follow. And thirdly, students who are absent will miss everything unless an intervention is made. So, in a modern classroom, however, the teacher replaces lectures by recording short videos like what I'm doing right now, based on research supported practices. Now, students can fast forward through things they already know, pause to take notes or ask questions, and even have clarifications. 3. Rewind when they miss something. 4. Learn in school and at home. And number 5, to rewatch old videos in preparation for year-end assessments. So it's clear that it's still the teacher who teaches. Plus, parents can now watch these videos too and support learning at home, especially to their children. This all means that during class, teachers have their time giving each student the support they need, given that students have different or various learning needs. So you won't see a teacher standing up front managing behavior. Instead, the modern classroom teachers spend most of their time working with students alone or even in small groups. It actually depends on the number of students or the general population. So while other students learn through what? Videos or self-directed group work. First, teacher's role is actually divided into two things, the personal role and the teaching role. So, for the personal role, the teacher is an individual that is expected not to possess a dignified personality and a modest behavior, primarily because the teacher sets as an example, an exemplar or the role model for for the students to imitate. The teacher's attitude as a person greatly influences the student's success. Because the number one goal here of the teacher is not just to teach, but even part of teaching is inspiring the students. Whether it's coming from an elementary, secondary, or even a tertiary. The teacher's standards are the student's standards. So an ideal teacher should be moral, ethical, non-judgmental, and well disciplined. The teacher should admit not knowing the answer, because it would be extremely odd for the teacher to give an impression of being know-it-all. It's also okay not to admit that you don't know something, because that's where learning comes from. That's the starting point of learning, where you admit your ignorance so that you can ask, and after asking questions or clarifying some things that you deemed at first as a mere abstraction, now you know something. That's actually the basis of knowledge acquisition, when you ask because you don't know something. The teacher should also allow students to work out their own contribution, never make suggestions, and interrupt in the student's thinking. So this is what we call, there's a stream of consciousness on the end of the students. That is why you can also, as a teacher, you can give feedback or responses, whether it's positive or negative, of course, in a manner that would not hurt the students. So it embraces sensitivity, and at the same time, again, you don't interrupt, the students' thinking, for allowing them to think on their creative, their best knowledge, and to the best of their creativity. How about the teaching role? So, imparting education is the major role of teacher. Appropriate selection of various methods and media that stimulates the creativity and innovation of the students. There's also a proper clarification of doubts and concerns, evaluating outcomes of students. Those are the general roles of being a teacher. But if we are trying to dissect more about it, we see that there are at least 8 roles of being a teacher, coming from controller down to an observer. So let's first discuss each. So the teacher as a controller, of course, it gives us a negative impression. right? Oh, you're a controller. You are trying to be authoritative or manipulative, but it can also be good, no? As we need someone to initiate, and the teacher is best or befits that type of role. So in this case, the teacher is in charge of the class and of the activity. The teacher, no, fronted classroom. So again, it has its manifestations of the traditional ones, right? The teacher centered or the custodial type. From the word itself, custodial, we are the students in a sense are confined under the authority of the teacher, but of course not in a negative light or in a bad manner. So controller, which means you take charge of the class. So there should be someone who will going to facilitate, or there should be someone who will be the starting point of a particular activity in order for something, particularly the learning, to not just take place but also to roll over. The teacher as an organizer. The teachers should be able to organize students to do various activities, and this is actually very challenging, no, since it cannot be separated with the classroom management. And again, the challenge here is to link the classroom management and the instructional approaches, given that students nowadays are having a hard time in learning, maybe because of the pandemic, but as well as it's also realized, no, in response to a lot of researchers that students, no, obviously have varied learning styles and have a different way of learning. And so we have to embrace multimodal teaching practices or approaches. So the as you can see from the image here, we have the words to engage, and it's very important as a teacher to draw not only to draw the attention of the students, but there should be connection. There should be an in form of engagement between the teacher and the learners, and then you'll be able to strike them, no, at the heart, not to pierce their soul with your instruction, and then you initiate something, whatever. From the word itself, organize, you organize something, you plan something out of them, especially for instance, you're doing an assessment or you're trying to prepare the students for the next lesson. So we have to initiate, and you must be creative and resourceful. And we also have, and part of organizing is not only the planning, the structuring, the systematic way of structuring our, for example, the lesson plan, the formation of the objectives or the target accomplishments that needs to be done by the students, but as well as the feedback, so that the students are properly assessed, and so we determine their strengths and weaknesses, especially that we don't only focus on the four macro skills already, right? The reading, writing, speaking, and listening, but there's also another one, no, added in the macro skills. It's not already four but five, and that is the video, or the inclusion of the technology as the world is becoming more digitalized. Third one, the teacher as a participant. Teachers may want to join in activity not as teachers, but as participants in their own right. Students will enjoy having the teacher with them, although it cannot be denied that on the end of the students, they would give us always the impression that, okay, maybe the teachers are doing this, but still they are teachers. But it cannot be denied because of the hierarchy of, or shall I say, the power dynamics, the difference that sets apart students and teachers. But it's also important that the teachers give a warm atmosphere, not too strict, not too tolerant, but somewhere in the middle, where the teacher and the student will work collaboratively, and there will be a, shall I say, peer-to-peer type of relationship, setting aside all these hierarchical structures, or our standings in life, but we immerse on the world of the students, and so that the students will have finally to understand that perhaps the teacher is really passionate, and so you pass that energy to the students. And I can also relate to that in my experience while teaching. teaching, no, in my two classes given by you, ma'am, about the understanding the self and the general society. So last time when you were not around, ma'am, because of your flu, so I had an activity from our students for a while, just a brief activity, asking them questions, trying to connect with them, knowing their thoughts and emotions about their spiritual self, for instance. So you see, they are not seeing me as separate from them. They are not seeing me, even though I'm a teacher, they are not seeing me as a separate entity, but a part of their world, a part of them. So me as a teacher is like a student. The teacher as the assessor. So what does it mean to say assess? So we already understood what assessment is, right? So teachers should be able to offer feedback, whether it's positive or negative. Why? We offer feedback because that's the main goal of learning. How do we know if we're right or wrong if there is no feedback on the end of someone, specifically a teacher, no, to giving correction and having grades students in various ways, because without feedback we don't know into what aspect we are good at. We don't know our strengths and weaknesses, so we don't formulate on the end of the students, they don't know how to formulate the proper coping mechanisms, perhaps, or the teaching methods, because as they grow, the students, they will also have to experiment on various learning styles or teaching methods that they best preferred, perhaps. And so it's part of assessment, no? So that they know why did they commit that particular mistake, on what end, what circumstances did they have to create that particular mistake, why is it wrong, no? So you give a feedback. For example, the best here is that as an intervention is tutor, no, so that it will not only enhance the student's skills and talents in a particular field or subject matter, but also there's not only passing of information, but also a form of analysis. They can also become critical as you try to explain or justify to them why their answers are wrong, and why the answer should be like this and like that, which is the right one. Okay? The teacher as a prompter. Now, when you say prompter, we often think of the reporters, no, using prompters as their guide, not to read something, or even hosts do that. No, there's a script, no, running, and you have to read that. So in a way, no, the clue term or the key term here is that guidance. So the teachers now should be able to motivate their students. And part of, I think, the part of motivation here, because motivation and emotion are often tagged as factors in learning. Actually, there's a research on that one from a local researcher here, Dr. Rex A. Lim, entitled Affective Filter in Focus in the cases of students in a particular school, high school here in Davao City, where students are shy, no, in learning oral communication, no, in senior high school. So why am I bringing this up? Because the teacher's role uh, the teacher's role is to encourage and motivate learners to study well and even to behave properly in and outside the classroom. And of course, the teachers would do that by being the example. And the teacher is, of course, good at motivating learners to make them listen, participate, and understand instructions. The teacher as a resource. The teacher will want to be helpful and available. Teachers answer to some questions from the students. Teachers can be one of the most important resources students have when they ask how to say or write something, want to know what a word or phrase means. And it is also similar to what we call as leader, no? The teacher directs, no, coaches, supports, and delegates depending on the needs of the situation. That is why, to be a good leader, you must be a good follower. Or shall I say, a model? The teacher should look his or her best all the time. master the lessons, show interest, and have this passion in the learner's welfare. Show good behavior, and even include good work and personality or attitude. The teacher now as the tutor. Teachers working with individuals or small groups, teacher will allow more personal contact and real chance for feel supported and helped. And this is also similar to what we called as a facilitator, right? The learners must be given a chance to discuss things under the close supervision and monitoring of the teacher. So the teacher then prepares guidelines which will serve as the focus of discussion and activity, especially those things that the students are somewhat having difficulty with or are challenged, like the weaknesses of the students. Because of the argument that it's already the strength of the students, why focus on that? They will be pampered if you only focus on the student's strengths. So we have to focus more on the students' weaknesses so that they will know the bigger picture, and it would barely scratch the surface of a seemingly complex matter. The teacher now as the observer. Now observe what the students do whenever you are doing an activity. You have to take down notes on that one. For example, if the student is doing something like an activity, you have to observe because that will be the basis of your assessment in the first place. For example, if you're doing an activity and you find that most students are not interested, you have to take it down. And so that you can consider what are probably the reasons for their maybe lack of motivation, the lack of interest in that particular activity. Maybe the activity is not familiar to them. Maybe the activity is not that engaging. Maybe the activity creates more division, something like that. Especially in oral activities. Again, this is anchored on the big skills in education, the reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And this is actually important in the sense that the main function of the teacher is instruction. So teachers make decisions as to what to teach, what instructional materials to use, what method to employ in teaching a particular content, and how best not to evaluate the intended learning. And of course, through feedback. Now, the question is of all those roles mentioned, which is which, or which particular role should best fit? Actually, teachers need to be able to switch between the various roles, judging when it is appropriate to use one or the other. So it actually depends now on the end of the teacher which one he or she will use. Teachers need to be aware of how they carry out the selective role and how they perform it. That is why, as I've already stated earlier, regarding the difference between a traditional classroom and a modern classroom, it's very important that rather than being nailed between the two extremes, we have to focus, we have to embrace the blended learning, particularly to retain some things or concepts from traditional classroom, and of course to embrace as well the principles governed in the modern classroom so that we can effectively push for inclusive and not exclusive learning to befit the learner's needs or whatever it is. Given the illustration, I want you to comment down on the following words like advisor, coach, mentor, role model, and a leader. And give their own definitions. Take note not to plagiarize anything from the internet because it would cost you right off the bat, your grades. Another thing that we have to focus on is the instructor role. This is actually the main role for the teacher to carry out. No? Prepares lesson plan by identifying the learning objectives, selecting appropriate teaching learning activities based on those objectives, and organizing them in a logical sequence. Creates an environment that is conducive to learning, collects the education material that are helpful for students learning and presents them effectively, presents learning experience in logical and coherent manner by using good communication skills. And that is also one of the primary movers for the teacher, because it will give an impression that you are really credible as a speaker, and you will uh, draw the attention of the students, and so they will listen well rather than just hearing it. Encourage students' participation, gives accurate and relevant information on the topic. And of course, the goal here is to clarifying, the clarification of the skill competency expected from the students. That is why it's very important as a teacher that you are not only creative but flexible. No? Guides and supervises students in clinical experience, teaching, which consists of a complex role involving a series of activities like supplying information needed or telling them where it must be obtained, explaining, clarifying, and interpretation, no demonstrating or explaining a procedure, a process, or exhibiting materials, serving as a resource person for group projects or to individual students, supervising students' performance in the classroom, the laboratory, and in any other setting where the student or of nursing may be having learning experiences. So in this case, we are talking about a particular student's needs, but then again, we're trying to embrace the inclusivity and not just enclose or confine our understanding alone of a student in a specific group. No? So in modern classrooms, we see that uh, it there's an enjoyable type of learning, and students can understand what they are learning and teach themselves new content and skills and to complete challenging assignments without giving up. So it's already mentioned earlier, no, about the facilitator. It's very important developing rapport or connection with the students. Again, their key term is engagement. So this adds acts as an additional information on the general eight general or major roles of a teacher. Okay, this is on the end for facilitators. This is as well for the manager or the leader. And we also have the on the end, now we have counselor. So when I say counselor, a teacher talks to the students if they have any learning difficulties, helps the students in dealing with personal problems, and uh, it also acts as a guide in matter of professionalism, counsel students with academic matters. That is why as a teachers, they are expected to respond constructively when problems chop up or crop up concerning the student's behavior. And teachers provide guidance and assistance if students experience these similar problems. Evaluator finds out the reason for learning difficulty, uses learning sessions conducted in various settings for ongoing evaluation. And another thing that we have to understand is teachers act as well as a public relations specialist. In other words, self PR or public relations. So teachers deal with people outside the school with credibility. Teachers must have a good public relations to make a good name for the school. Another thing here is the teacher acts as well as a parent surrogate, meaning the teacher is the parent of the learners. So also expected to train the learners socially and emotionally and to look after their physical and mental well-being. The teacher guarantees that the individual rights of the learners in education and safety is what? Is guaranteed or respected. So what about the learner's role? So compared to the teacher's roles, we see there as a general impression that there are eight major principles of the roles of teachers. But as we see here, and the roles of learner, we only have few, but very important. Again, because of the contention that students learning are varied. They are too varied to the point that even if we give you the eight major roles of the teachers, it cannot still satisfy or to say guarantee. It's not sufficient enough to really guarantee or somewhat accurately we can measure, but not really to the point of accuracy. Na. We cannot accurately measure because of the students' wild imagination, and it's just because probably of the rationality, no, that we cannot really measure on the end of the students, given their varied belief system, philosophies, etc., etc. So these are the roles of the learner. No, so engage actively in learning activity. Learners are also assessed as a part of daily learning through a range of activities including dialogue and interaction with peers and teachers, no? Practical investigations, performances, oral presentations, and discussions. Learners are assessed on written work and on products such as an artwork, no, report, or even projects. Moreover, uh, they are also expected to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding, skills, capabilities on a particular subject matter, to review their own learning through self-assessment. So students, for example, in a modern classroom, don't just sit and listen. No? Unlike, again, in a traditional classroom where they just sit and receive information passively. So again, they're expected, no, to not just sit and listen, but to actively engage, to participate whatever is given to them. And sometimes they are tasked, to be the organizers, to initiate, to prepare them on the real world scenarios. Again, to actively engage. Whether they are watching videos independently or collaborating with classmates to master a new skill, they are always appropriately challenged and supported. So actually, it's a research-backed approach, no? Which gives students greater ownership of their learning, builds executive functioning, and self-management skills, and makes learning fun.
Tell me if this has happened to you.
So, what is a modern
You come to
classroom?
school one day,
To
the
answer that
teacher's at the
question,
board, and
allow me
it's
to
time
share
for
you
the
a video.
lesson. Except you were
Please write your
homesick
comment,
yesterday. So when the teacher starts
or shall I
talking,
say,
you're not
learn
sure what they're
insights
talking
based on
about.
the video
You're
given.
lost. Or maybe you learned this last year. So when the teacher explains what you already know, you're bored. Or maybe you're just having a bad day. It happens. The teacher's talking, but you can't focus. You're distracted. And meanwhile, the teacher's not sure what to do. The teacher is stressed. But what if your teacher steps down from the front of the room? If you are sick, you don't have to worry. Your teacher's lessons are on video, so you can pick up right where you left off. This isn't from YouTube, by the way. Your teacher made the video, and you're watching them explain. So you're not lost anymore. You're engaged. And if you already know the content, you can move ahead and do an extension activity. You can work on this with your classmates. Now you aren't bored anymore. You're challenged. And if you're having a bad day, the teacher has time to sit with you. They can ask what's wrong and help you feel better. You aren't distracted anymore. You feel supported. And by the way, your teacher realizes that they can meet your needs and they can feel successful. We call this a modern classroom. Welcome! In a modern classroom, you'll notice 3 new things. First, your teacher is creating videos for you. You can watch these videos in class or at home. You can pause, rewind, rewatch, or skip ahead if you get it. These don't replace your teacher, they just clone your teacher so that they can support you individually. Next, you'll learn at your own pace. When you get things quickly, you move ahead quickly. When you need more time, you'll have the time you need. This means you'll learn as much as you can without being rushed or held back. Finally, you're really going to learn things. In fact, you'll master them. You won't move to lesson 2 until you really understand lesson 1. So when you learn something new, you're really going to learn it. After all, you're too capable for anything less than true understanding. So that's a modern classroom for you. Now what are you waiting for? Let's learn!
So before we formally end our discussion, I would like to add a little bit more about one of the important roles on the end of the students, and that should be being inquisitive. But before that, we highlight other responsibilities of students. Like generally, there's this list of additional duties of students that they should perform in the classroom environment. For example, no, simple respect and obedience to the teachers, maintaining discipline in the class, is keeping the school neat and tidy, be helpful by clearing their materials after a class, abide by the rules of the school, participate in the activities organized in the school, even cooperate with the teachers, decorate their classrooms with charts, posters, but actually depends on the culture created by the instructors or the culture and the classroom per se. But going back to being inquisitive because it promotes a in a class culture a sense of accountability because in education the teachers tend to value a student's ability to answer the teacher's questions, but it may be more important as well to gauge their ability to ask their own great questions, and again and more critically their willingness to do so. So in the sense, it's very important to make the students feel comfortable enough to respectfully ask all sorts of questions that nurture their curiosity. So, right, it's very important. And another thing I think would be the students should come to school ready to participate. And why does this matter? Because the full academic engagement maximizes the opportunity for learning and sets the tone for the entire classroom. This includes, but is not limited to, asking and answering questions, completing in class assignments, and consistently aligning behavior to the classroom norms. In a sense, thus, students should always acknowledge that they are part of a learning community, and each person is responsible for taking ownership of their actions in a way that values building safe and positive classrooms. So, for your assignment, again, you can also post this on the classroom or send this on my email so that you will be assessed. I want you to watch the documentary made by Ma'am Cara David entitled Paa, Kamay, at Mata. To give you a heads up, it's actually in response of the government's lack of funding, especially in special education. And on the end of the students, consider the various viewpoints and probably make a reflective essay about it. Maximum of 4 pages. I mean, maximum of 5 pages and a minimum of 3 pages. So, any additional questions and the clarifications, you can also post that as well on our Google Classroom. Okay? Once again, thank you very much, and I hope that you learned something from today's session. Thank you, and God bless us all.